We had reached cruising altitude and the passenger airplane I was sitting aboard was sailing turbulently through the sky, riding on air currents and exploiting physics in ways that I would never understand. Maybe it was my ignorance of these principles which made me so nervous, my legs trembling with constant vibrations. My teeth had even been chattering for a while during takeoff. But now my nerves had settled down to a dull roar. "Are you sure you're alright?" the white-haired man sitting next to me asked, his hand settling on my arm in a comforting way. "Should I call the stewardess over? She can get you some water, or a cup of tea to calm the nerves? With a shot of brandy too, maybe?" He laughed, gripping my arm just a little too firmly now. "I'm fine," I said. "The worst of it's past. As long as we don't run into engine trouble I should be okay." That statement caught a few angry glares from passengers nearby, who quickly went back to reading or talking amongst themselves. I scolded myself internally for saying my worst fears out loud. Nobody liked to think about engine trouble when they were flying over the Atlantic Ocean in the middle of the night. "Well, let's not speak of those things just now. Do you want a book to read? I brought a spare novel. It's a John Grisham." "No, thanks." "Well, how about some television? I think they have cable on these little things nowadays." He pointed at the screen on the headrest in front of me. I hadn't even noticed it there. "That's a good idea. Maybe I can find something to distract myself." I turned the power on and noticed immediately the lack of sound. Of course, I had forgotten to bring earphones. "Here," the man next to me said, handing me a pair of his own. "I'm not using them right now. You can borrow them." They were the kind with foam pads on the outside of the headphones, not earbuds, so I felt relatively safe using them, even though I am a bit of a germaphobe. At least we wouldn't be swapping earwax. "Thanks," I said, taking them and putting them on. Plugging the cord into the headphone jack. A squeal of feedback caused me to recoil, and I turned the volume down, finding it had been set to maximum. The man was speaking again and I pulled back the headphone to hear him better. "Anything I can do to help? I used to have a terrible fear of flying, you know. But after you do this a few times you start to get used to it." I smiled weakly, feeling nauseated from not eating. I hadn't been able to stomach breakfast that morning or any other meal for that matter. It had been over 24 hours since I'd eaten or slept, due to my nerves about flying. Putting the earphones back on, I began to flip through the channels on a little television set in front of me. Discovery Channel came on and I decided to leave it there. It was a show about the Amazon rainforest, describing ancient civilizations which had resided in the jungles. Using new technology, they had found the outlines of massive cities which had housed millions of ancient Amazonians. Their gods and their myths, lost over hundreds of years. I was watching this as the man sitting next to me began to remove something from his bag. It was a Tupperware container with a bright red lid on top. He opened the lid and an odor fouler than anything I had ever experienced wafted out, hitting me in the face like a punch to the nose. It smelled like old, rancid seafood. Like a dumpster that has been sitting open in the hot sun, full of used diapers and bad shrimp. The man produced a fork from his bag and lifted the container to his nose, closing his eyes as he savored the smell. Using his hand like a fan, he waved more of the stink towards his face, like a gourmand about to eat a Michelin star meal. Despite my own disgust, I couldn't help but steal a glance at what was inside the container. It looked like a fish had been tossed in a food processor, bones and all, only it hadn't been blended for long enough. There were still obvious pieces of bone, scales, and a fish head that could be seen left partially intact. A bulging white eyeball was prominent among the pieces. He dug in his fork and took a large bite, going for the eyeball first. I heard it squish between his teeth and explode in his mouth. Black, viscous fluid dribbled down his chin, landing on his shirt. I couldn't believe nobody was complaining about the smell. Nobody else seemed to even notice, except for me. If not for how nice he had been to me, I would have said something. The stink was really making me feel sick. He saw me looking and dug his fork into the mess, then held out a large, heaping bite for me. I could practically see the stink lines coming off of it, like a cartoon skunk. "Did you want to try some?" he asked, his yellow teeth showing as he smiled. That grin, somehow predatory and leering, made me second-guess everything about the man. Suddenly he didn't seem nice anymore. He was mocking and cruel, his previous niceties were just a facade to hide his true nature. And what an actor he was. "No thanks," I said, gulping down a lump of bile in my throat, trying to force a smile but failing miserably. "I just ate before the flight." He looked at me as if staring directly into my soul. Then he shook his head as if saying no, like he didn't believe me. He sucked his teeth and went back to his meal. You shouldn't lie to me, you know. I pretended not to hear that and went back to looking at the television, trying to distract myself from the scene happening next to me. But my heart was thumping fast now and I could feel a throbbing pulse in my jugular. The Amazon History Show was finished and now something else was on. It was a show about aviation disasters and how planes malfunction before crashing. A voiceover was speaking about horrible tragedies and near misses, showing computer-generated images illustrating the critical parts of the airplane which had broken. Then they switched to the passenger footage which had been recorded on people's phones during troubled flights. During this AirAsia flight, severe turbulence caused the hospitalization of more than 5 passengers, as the plane was eventually rerouted to Tokyo. The screen showed images of a plane's interior, shuddering up and down violently and sending people flying into the ceiling and into the aisles. Women and men could be heard screaming as luggage cascaded from overhead compartments and people prayed for safety. "I was on that flight," the man next to me said, licking his gore-smeared fingers clean. "One hell of an inch flight meal, let me tell you." I tried turning off the television, but it didn't work. I tried to change the channels, but that button was broken too. It was stuck on this particular program, and there was no way to get rid of it. Instead, I tore the headphones off and unplugged them, handing them back to the man. "You don't want to watch it anymore?" he asked, slurping up some of the roadkill casseroles. "No. Thanks for letting me use your headphones. I think I'm just gonna try to take a nap." "Suit yourself," he said, crunching a bone between his teeth. "I'll wake you up for meal service." How he could still be hungry was a mystery to me, after he had just ingested such a monstrous dinner. I was already beginning to suspect there was something off about this man. The way he had changed was unsettling, and I felt like I was suddenly in the Twilight Zone. He just wasn't acting normal, so I watched him out of the corner of my eye for a while, trying to convince myself he was just a bit odd, and nothing to worry about. He was just an eccentric with a very unusual diet. Eventually, I managed to convince myself that was true, and despite my unease, my tiredness won over everything else and I fell asleep. I didn't remember my dreams, only waking up to find myself completely alone on the plane. The hateful man sitting next to me was gone and so was everyone else. The plane was still rumbling turbulently through the air, but now with no one in it. I looked outside and saw the sky was clear and bright blue, instead of the night like it had been. But we were flying towards a dark thunderhead, booming with lightning up ahead in the distance. The storm front looked to be 10 miles high and 1,000 miles wide, a swirling, dark mass of angry weather. A Category 5 hurricane that could take out a city without warning. I stood up and looked around the plane, still not understanding how it could be empty. Where had everyone gone? How long had I been out? Had they allowed me to sleep right through deplaning? Before I had another moment to think, the plane bounced up and down with a sickening yo-yo motion, then careened to the side. It did this a few more times, in rapid succession, pitching forward and backwards so that I was thrown off balance and sent tumbling into the aisle. By the time it settled again, I wanted to puke. But at least the plane had leveled out again. I stood up from the floor and glanced out the window. I saw we had just passed into the massive thunderhead, and the inside of the plane was suddenly pitch black. There was a voice whispering from all around me, speaking my worst fears aloud. Black, inky tendrils like smoke began to reach out toward me from the shadows. "You're alone. The plane is going down. It will sink. In the middle of the ocean. Freezing. Drowning. Water in your lungs. Falling, dropping, plunging from the sky. You know you're going to die." I stumbled forward down the aisle, moving towards the cockpit. They needed to turn this plane around. How did they not see it? The interior panels of the plane on both sides suddenly made loud, rending noises, as if the craft were beginning to break apart at the seams. The walls bent inwards, exposing the insulation, and a sound like a popcorn slowly being crushed could be heard from all around me. Thunder crashed loudly outside and the panels pulled apart further, until I could hear the howling wind and rain and saw it blowing into the cabin. Lightning flashed and I could see it through a gap in the side of the plane, which grew even wider before my eyes. "It's going down," I yelled, stumbling forward. "We're gonna crash." The plane dipped and climbed upwards in a sickening way as we hit another pocket of turbulence. My heart was in my throat, my stomach doing backflips, as I lurched down the aisle holding onto the backs of chairs for support. Finally, I managed to reach the door of the cockpit. There were no flight attendants or passengers that I could see, but there had to be someone flying this plane. I began to hammer on the door, screaming at them to let me in. "It's going down." I screamed again and again. I heard laughter coming from the darkness all around me as I yelled at the captain hiding behind his steel door. Once again I found myself on the floor, being tossed around in the turbulence, as we hit another rough patch. I put my hands over my head and tried to cover my face as the plane's fuselage began to come apart and the wings began to break free from the body. Looking up, I saw the door to the cockpit was now open and there was no one sitting inside. The pilot and co-pilot seats were empty. I staggered to my feet to right the controls the moment I saw inside the cockpit. The plane began to plummet from the sky. It went into a nosedive and I was once again thrown back into the aisle, this time by the force of multiple Gs. I was screaming when I opened my eyes and found myself staring up at the faces of dozens of anxious passengers all around me. The flight attendants looked less anxious and more upset, as I had just ruined their quiet flight with what probably appeared to be a total nervous breakdown. To the other passengers, it appeared that I was sleeping, then collapsed into the aisle screaming about the plane crashing. I would have believed it was just a nightmare too, if not for the bruises I would find all over myself. Bruises left from my time being tossed around by the turbulence on the plane. Several concerned passengers and crew ushered me back to my seat, where I was momentarily left alone again with the old man and his yellow teeth and horrible appetite. "You made quite a scene back there," he said, picking his teeth with a toothpick. "It was so real," I muttered. "How did it feel so real?" He didn't answer. Instead, he began to speak about another topic. "Do you know what's funny about fear?" he asked. The question was hypothetical, so I just looked at him and waited for his answer. "The funny thing about fear, at least when it comes to you humans, is that it doesn't work well if it gets dumped on you all at once. You need to get scared, then feel like everything is okay, then you can get scared again even more. But you start to feel desensitized to it if it comes at you non-stop. That's why horror movies have highs and lows. Moments of build-up and tension before the jump scare." The man's belly was swollen and one of his shirt buttons popped off, flying into the seat in front of him and clicking loudly off the television screen embedded there. He looked full, fat, happy, and satisfied for the first time since I'd met him. As if he'd just eaten a huge meal. Gears were turning in my mind as I looked into his glossy black eyes and began to understand who he was, or at least what his motivations were. Just as I suspected, he was not a man at all. "Bright lad," he said as if he'd just read my mind. "I had a feeling you'd figure it out. It was you. The voice in the empty plane. You made me think it was real, and then you fed on my fear. You dined on it like that disgusting shit in your Tupperware container. Ah, but fresh is always better than leftovers. I thank you, though. I haven't had a meal like that in quite a while. Your terror was so deep and so strong. What happened to you, anyway?" I winced as if slapped, remembering my parents. Somehow, I had a feeling he already knew about them. Why else would he ask? Maybe he wasn't as satisfied as he looked. I hit the call button and waited for a stewardess to come over, then I asked her if I could switch seats. I told her I'd sit anywhere, as long as it wasn't next to the disgusting old man beside me. "I think he's a demon," I said. Now, I know how that sounds, but hear me out. The flight attendant gave me a worried look, as did several other passengers sitting in the vicinity. She cleared her throat and leaned in, speaking under her breath in an attempt to salvage what was left of my pride. "Sir. The seat beside you is empty. I've been watching you throughout this flight and there's been nobody sitting there. You've been alone, and to be frank, you've been talking to yourself quite a bit. It's starting to worry some of the other passengers." I stammered something, looking at the old man, unable to turn away from his wrinkled face and yellow teeth, pulled up in a widening grin. "It's my responsibility to alert the captain of this and have you returned home to America for a psychiatric evaluation. You've got bruises all over you and it's obvious you're not able to care for yourself properly based on your behavior during this flight. You're a danger to yourself and possibly to others." An air marshal was sitting nearby and stood up, removing a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "I've heard enough. And I agree with your assessment, miss. I appreciate your patience with this man. He's obviously very unwell." Despite my protests, which quickly turned to screams, he handcuffed one of my wrists to my seat. Luckily this plane is on a return trip to America after a couple of hours layover here. So we'll be back up in the air in no time. The two of them walked away, leaving me alone with the fear-eating demon sitting next to me. His true form was slowly beginning to show through the cracking facade of his human appearance, and I could see the rotting hell flesh beneath. "No, no, no. Please. Don't make me go back. I don't want to go back. I'll take a boat. Let me take a boat. Just anything but this plane. You need to get me off this plane." "Don't worry," said the old man, drool cascading out from his lower lip. They used to be scared of flying too. But, after a few times, you'll start to get used to it.